Volume 2, Postscript and Notes of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott, Volume 2, Postscript and Notes. Postscript. The second article of the appendix to the introduction to Rob Roy contains two curious letters respecting the arrest of Mr. Graham of Killearn by that daring freebooter, while levying the Duke of Montrose's rents. These were taken from scroll copies in the possession of his Grace the present Duke, who kindly permitted the use of them in the present publication. The novel had but just passed through the press, when the Right Honourable Mr. Peel, whose important state avocations do not avert his attention from the interests of literature, transmitted to the author copies of the original letters and enclosure, of which he possessed only the rough draft. The originals were discovered in the State Paper Office by the indefatigable researches of Mr. Lemon, who is daily throwing more light on that valuable collection of records. From the documents with which the author has been thus kindly favoured, he is enabled to fill up the addresses which were wanting in the scrolls. That of the 21st of November 1716 is addressed to Lord Viscount Townshend, and is accompanied by one of the same date to Robert Pringle, Esquire, Under Secretary of State, which is here inserted as relative to so curious an incident. Letter from the Duke of Montrose to Robert Pringle, Esquire, Under Secretary to Lord Viscount Townshend. Sir, Glasgow, 21st of November 1716. Having had so many dispatches to make this night, I hope ye'll excuse me that I make use of another hand to give you a short account of the occasion of this express, by which I have written to my Lord Duke of Roxburgh and my Lord Townshend, which I hope ye'll get carefully delivered. Mr. Graham, younger of Killearn, being on Monday last in Menteith at a country house, collecting my rents, was about 9 o'clock that same night surprised by Rob Roy with a party of his men in arms, who, having surrounded the house and secured the avenues, presented their guns in at the windows, while he himself entered the room with some others with cocked pistols, and seized Killearn with all his money, books, papers, and bonds, and carried all away with him to the hills, at the same time ordering Killearn to write a letter to me, of which ye have the copy enclosed, proposing a very honourable treaty to me. I must say the story was as surprising to me as it was insolent, and it must bring a very great concern upon me that this gentleman, my near relation, should be brought to suffer all the barbarities and cruelties which revenge and malice may suggest to these miscreants, for his having acted a faithful part in the service of the government, and his affection to me in my concerns. I need not be more particular to you, since I know that my letter to my Lord Townshend will come into your hands, so shall only now give you the assurances of my being, with great sincerity, Sir, your most humble servant, signed Montrose. I long exceedingly for a return of my former dispatches to the secretaries about Methven and Colonel Urquhart, and my wife's cousins, Balnamoon and Finhaven. I must beg you'll give my humble service to Mr. Secretary Methven, and tell him that I must refer him to what I have written to my Lord Townshend in this affair of Rob Roy, believing it was needless to trouble both with letters. Examined, Robert Lemon, Deputy Keeper of State Papers, State Paper Office, November the 4th, 1829. Note, the enclosure referred to in the preceding letter is another copy of the letter which Mr. Graham of Killearn was compelled by Rob Roy to write to the Duke of Montrose, and is exactly the same as the one enclosed in his Grace's letter to Lord Townshend, dated November 21st, 1716. R.L. The last letter in the appendix number 2, 28th of November, acquainting the government with Killearn's being set at liberty, is also addressed to the Under Secretary of State, Mr. Pringle. The author may also here remark that immediately previous to the insurrection of 1715, he perceives from some notes of information given to government that Rob Roy appears to have been much employed and trusted by the Jacobite party even in the very delicate task of transporting specie to the Earl of Breadalbane, though it might have somewhat resembled trusting Don Raphael and Ambrose de Lamela with the church treasure. Notes to Rob Roy, Dugald Chair Moor. Note A. The Grey Stone of MacGregor. I have been informed that at no very remote period it was proposed to take this large stone, which marks the grave of Dugald Chair Moor, and convert it to the purpose of the lintel of a window, the threshold of a door, or some such mean use. A man of the clan MacGregor, who was somewhat deranged, took fire at this insult, and when the workmen came to remove the stone, planted himself upon it with a broad axe in his hand, swearing he would dash out the brains of any one who should disturb the monument. Athletic in person, and insane enough to be totally regardless of consequences, it was thought best to give way to his humour, and the poor madman kept sentinel on the stone day and night, till the proposal of removing it was entirely dropped. Note B. Dugald Chair Moor. The above is the account which I find in a manuscript history of the clan MacGregor, of which I was indulged with a perusal by Donald MacGregor, Esquire, late Major of the 33rd Regiment, where great pains have been taken to collect traditions and written documents concerning the family. But an ancient and constant tradition preserved among the inhabitants of the country, and particularly those of the clan MacFarlane, relieves Dugald Chair Moor of the guilt of murdering the youths, and lays the blame on a certain Donald, or Duncan Lean, who performed the act of cruelty, with the assistance of a gillie who attended him, named Charlioch, or Charlie. They say that the homicides dared not again join their clan, but that they resided in a wild and solitary state as outlaws, in an unfrequented part of the MacFarlanes' territory. Here they lived for some time undisturbed, till they committed an act of brutal violence on two defenceless women, a mother and daughter of the MacFarlane clan. In revenge of this atrocity, the MacFarlanes hunted them down and shot them. It is said that the younger ruffian, Charlioch, might have escaped, being remarkably swift of foot, but his crime became his punishment, for the female whom he had outraged had defended herself desperately, and had stabbed him with his own dirk in the thigh. He was lame from the wound, and was the more easily overtaken and killed. I always inclined to think this last the true edition of the story, and that the guilt was transferred to Dugald Chair Moor as a man of higher name, but I have learned that Dugald was in truth dead several years before the battle, my authority being his representative, Mr. Gregerson of Ardtornish. See also note to Introduction, Legend of Montrose, Volume 6. Note C. The Loch Lomond Expedition. The Loch Lomond Expedition was judged worthy to form a separate pamphlet, which I have not seen, but as quoted by the historian Ray, it must be delectable. On the morrow, being Thursday the 13th, they went on their expedition, and about noon came to Inversnaid, the place of danger, where the Paisley men and those of Dumbarton, and several of the other companies, to the number of 100 men, with the greatest intrepidity leapt on shore, got up to the top of the mountains, and stood a considerable time beating their drums all the while. But no enemy appearing, they went in quest of their boats, which the rebels had seized, and having casually lighted on some ropes and oars hid among the shrubs, at length they found the boats drawn up a good way on the land, which they hurled down to the loch. Some of them, as were not damaged, they carried off with them, and such as were, they sank and hewed to pieces. That same night they returned to Luss, and then next day to Dumbarton, from whence they had at first set out, bringing along with them the whole boats they found in their way on either side of the loch, and in the creeks of the isles, and mooring them under the cannon of the castle. During this expedition, the pinnaces discharging their pateraroes, and the men their small arms, made such a thundering noise through the multiplied rebounding echoes of the vast mountains on both sides of the loch, that the MacGregors were cowed and frighted away to the rest of the rebels, who were encamped at Strathfillan. Ray's History of the Rebellion, Tome 4, page 287. Note D. Author's expedition against the MacLarens. The author is uncertain whether it is worth while to mention that he had a personal opportunity of observing, even in his own time, that the king's writ did not pass quite current in the brass of Balquhidder. There were very considerable debts due by Stewart of Appin, chiefly to the author's family, which were likely to be lost to the creditors if they could not be made available out of this same farm of Invernenty, the scene of the murder done upon MacLaren. His family, consisting of several strapping deer stalkers, still possessed the farm, by virtue of a long lease for a trifling rent. There was no chance of any one buying it with such an encumbrance, and a transaction was entered into by the MacLarens, who, being desirous to emigrate to America, agreed to sell their lease to the creditors for £500, and to remove at the next term of Whitsunday. But whether they repented their bargain, or desired to make a better, or whether from a mere point of honour, the MacLarens declared they would not permit a summons of removal to be executed against them, which was necessary for the legal completion of the bargain. And such was the general impression that they were men capable of resisting the legal execution of warning by very effectual means, no king's messenger would execute the summons without the support of a military force. An escort of a sergeant and 6 men was obtained from a Highland regiment lying in Stirling, and the author, then a writer's apprentice, equivalent to the honourable situation of an attorney's clerk, was invested with the superintendence of the expedition, with directions to see that the messenger discharged his duty fully, and that the gallant sergeant did not exceed his part by committing violence or plunder. And thus it happened, oddly enough, that the author first entered the romantic scenery of Loch Katrine, of which he may perhaps say he has somewhat extended the reputation, riding in all the dignity of danger, with a front and rear guard and loaded arms. The sergeant was absolutely a Highland Sergeant Kite, full of stories of Rob Roy and of himself, and a very good companion. We experienced no interruption whatever, and when we came to Invernenty, found the house deserted. We took up our quarters for the night, and used some of the victuals which we found there. On the morning we returned as unmolested as we came. The MacLarens, who probably never thought of any serious opposition, received their money and went to America, where, having had some slight share in removing them from their pauper regna, I sincerely hope they prospered. The rent of Invernenty instantly rose from £10 to £70 or £80, and when sold the farm was purchased, I think by the late Laird of MacNab, at a price higher in proportion than what even the modern rent authorised the parties interested to hope for. Note E. Alan Breck Stewart. Alan Breck Stewart was a man likely in such a matter to keep his word. James Drummond MacGregor and he, like Catherine and Petruchio, were well matched for a couple of quiet ones. Alan Breck lived till the beginning of the French Revolution. About 1789, a friend of mine, then residing at Paris, was invited to see some procession which was supposed likely to interest him, from the windows of an apartment occupied by a Scottish Benedictine priest. He found, sitting by the fire, a tall, thin, raw-boned, grim-looking old man, with a petit croix of St. Louis. His visage was strongly marked by the irregular projections of the cheekbones and chin. His eyes were grey, his grizzled hair exhibited marks of having been red, and his complexion was weather-beaten and remarkably freckled. Some civilities in French passed between the old man and my friend, in the course of which they talked of the streets and squares of Paris, till at length the old soldier, for such he seemed and such he was, said with a sigh, in a sharp Highland accent, "Dear any of them is worth the history of Edinburgh." On inquiry, this admirer of Old Reekie, which he was never to see again, proved to be Alan Breck Stewart. He lived decently on his little pension, and had, in no subsequent period of his life, shown anything of the savage mood in which he is generally believed to have assassinated the enemy and oppressor, as he supposed him, of his family and clan. Note F. The Abbess of Wilton. The nunnery of Wilton was granted to the Earl of Pembroke upon its dissolution by the magisterial authority of Henry VIII. Or his son Edward VI. On the accession of Queen Mary of Catholic memory, the Earl found it necessary to reinstate the abbess and her fair recluses, which he did with many expressions of his remorse, kneeling humbly to the vestals, and inducting them into the convent and possessions from which he had expelled them. With the accession of Elizabeth, the accommodating earl again resumed his Protestant faith, and a second time drove the nuns from their sanctuary. The remonstrances of the abbess, who reminded him of his penitent expressions on the former occasion, could wring from him no other answer than that in the text, "Go spin, you jade, go spin." Note G. Mons Meg. Mons Meg was a large old-fashioned piece of ordnance, a great favourite with the Scottish common people. She was fabricated at Mons in Flanders, in the reign of James IV. or V. of Scotland. This gun figures frequently in the public accounts of the time, where we find charges for grease, to grease Meg's mouth withal, to increase, as every schoolboy knows, the loudness of the report, ribbons to deck her carriage, and pipes to play before her when she was brought from the castle to accompany the Scottish army on any distant expedition. After the Union, there was much popular apprehension that the regalia of Scotland and the subordinate palladium Mons Meg would be carried to England to complete the odious surrender of national independence. The regalia, sequestered from the sight of the public, were generally supposed to have been abstracted in this manner. As for Mons Meg, she remained in the castle of Edinburgh, till, by order of the Board of Ordnance, she was actually removed to Warwick, about 1757. The regalia, by his Majesty's special command, have been brought forth from their place of concealment in 1818, and exposed to the view of the people, by whom they must be looked upon with deep associations, and in this very winter of 1828-29, Mons Meg has been restored to the country, where that which in every other place or situation was a mere mass of rusty iron, becomes once more a curious monument of antiquity. Note H. Fairy superstition. The lakes and precipices, amidst which the Avon or River Forth has its birth, are still, according to popular tradition, haunted by the elfin people, the most peculiar but most pleasing of the creations of Celtic superstitions. The opinions entertained about these beings are much the same with those of the Irish, so exquisitely well narrated by Mr. Crofton Croker. An eminently beautiful little conical hill, near the eastern extremity of the valley of Aberfoyle, is supposed to be one of their peculiar haunts, and is the scene which awakens in Andrew Fairservice the terror of their power. It is remarkable that two successive clergymen of this parish of Aberfoyle have employed themselves in writing about this fairy superstition. The eldest of these was Robert Kirk, a man of some talents, who translated the Psalms into Gaelic verse. He had formerly been minister at the neighbouring parish of Balquhidder, and died at Aberfoyle in 1688, at the early age of 42. He was author of The Secret Commonwealth, which was printed after his death in 1691, an edition which I have never seen, and was reprinted in Edinburgh 1815. This is a work concerning the fairy people, in whose existence Mr. Kirk appears to have been a devout believer. He describes them with the usual powers and qualities ascribed to such beings in Highland tradition. But what is sufficiently singular, the Reverend Robert Kirk, author of the said treatise, is believed himself to have been taken away by the fairies, in revenge perhaps for having let in too much light upon the secrets of their commonwealth. We learn this catastrophe from the information of his successor, the late amiable and learned Dr. Patrick Graham, also minister at Aberfoyle, who, in his Sketches of Perthshire, has not forgotten to touch upon the Dianchi, or men of peace. The Reverend Robert Kirke was, it seems, walking upon a little eminence to the west of the present manse, which is still held a dun shee or fairy mound, when he sunk down, in what seemed to mortals a fit, and was supposed to be dead. This, however, was not his real fate. Mr. Kirke was the near relation of Graham of Dochrei, the ancestor of the present General Graham Stirling. Shortly after his funeral, he appeared, in the dress in which he had sunk down, to a medical relation of his own and of Dochrei. "Go," said he to him, "to my cousin Dochrei, and tell him that I am not dead. I fell down in a swoon, and was carried into fairyland where I now am. Tell him that when he and my friends are assembled at the baptism of my child," for he had left his wife pregnant, "I will appear in the room, and that if he throws the knife which he holds in his hand over my head, I will be released and restored to human society." The man, it seems, neglected for some time to deliver the message. Mr. Kirke appeared to him a second time, threatening to haunt him night and day till he executed his commission, which at length he did. The time of the baptism arrived. They were seated at table. The figure of Mr. Kirke entered, but the Laird of Dochrei, by some unaccountable fatality, neglected to perform the prescribed ceremony. Mr. Kirke retired by another door, and was seen no more. It is firmly believed that he is at this day in fairyland. Sketches of Perthshire, page 254. The treatise by Robert Kirke here mentioned was written in the year 1691, but not printed till 1815. Note I. Clachan of Aberfoil. I do not know how this might stand in Mr. Osbaldistone's day, but I can assure the reader, whose curiosity may lead him to visit the scenes of these romantic adventures, that the Clachan of Aberfoil now affords a very comfortable little inn. If he chances to be a Scottish antiquary, it will be an additional recommendation to him that he will find himself in the vicinity of the Reverend Dr. Patrick Graham, minister of the Gospel at Aberfoil, whose urbanity in communicating information on the subject of national antiquities is scarce exceeded even by the stores of legendary lore which he has accumulated. Original note. The respectable clergyman alluded to has been dead for some years. See note H. End of volume 2, postscript and notes. End of Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. Recording by Felicity Campbell, Whanganui, New Zealand.